What stats should a skill specialist have for it to trigger a lot of skill? At first glance, as a new player, you probably say, well, triple skill trigger sounds good, because a skill specialist should have the highest chance to proc its skill. Well, you would be right. If the question were, what stats a skill specialist should have for it to have the highest chance to proc the skill in one production? But in this video, I'm going to show you that if we're looking at the total skill count per day or skill triggers per day, this is not the case. In fact, in this situation, this combination is actually the best. And that's because how many skills you get in a day is both a function of the skill trigger, the rate, and also the speed of the Pokemon. Welcome back to another Pokemon Sleep video, it's Bro Vinny here. Before we dive into what combinations of sub-skills and nature would be best for your skill specialist, first we gotta understand, well, how does skill trigger actually work? And it's been understood for some time now that every time your Pokemon produces a berry or an ingredient or what we call a help or a production, it will have a chance to produce a skill. That chance in the calculator, in the RainNX calculator, is known as the skill trigger rate. So basically every time your Pokemon does produce a berry, the higher the skill trigger rate, the more likely a skill is going to proc. But that means that if your Pokemon can produce your berries or ingredients very quickly, it has a lot of speed, it's very fast, then overall you may get more skill triggers per day, because skill trigger rate is a function per production or per help. It's not a function of per period of time. If you wanted to know how much your Pokemon triggers per day, you would use this feature here. It's called expected skill count. Used to be called skill count. And what that measures is that assuming you collect every single production from the Pokemon, so in other words, you go and check your app every 20 minutes and clear out all of the productions of your Pokemon, how many times in a day your Pokemon is expected to trigger its skill. So it does account for speed and the skill trigger rate. And this matters more to you than the actual skill trigger rate per production. What you really want to know is how many times in a day or a period of time that your Pokemon will trigger its skill. And just to make this point really clear, we're going to look at the ingredient magnet Pokemon and we're going to sort them by skill trigger rate, and that's per production. The Pokemon that has the highest skill trigger rate is Slunking for ingredient magnet. But Slunking's speed or its frequency is very slow. So even though it has the highest trigger rate, it doesn't produce the most amount of ingredient magnet triggers per day. On the other hand, Vaporeon has a very high trigger rate, it's also fast. So if we look at the total skill count in a day, it actually comes out on top. And this is the number that actually matters in most situations. The only time where the skill trigger rate matters more, and we'll come back to this later, is during a period of time where you're away from the game, so you couldn't collect the skills. For example, you're at work, school, or you're tracking sleep, then the skill trigger rate can actually matter more. But I would like to point out that the wording of skill trigger rate is a little misleading, because in colloquial terms, when you're casually having a conversation, you could mean that skill trigger rate is a per period of time definition. So if you do talk about skill trigger rate with other people, make sure you clarify whether you're talking about the rate per production or per day or per period of time. Alright, so now we're going to try and answer the question of which skills or stats actually provide the best overall outcome in terms of the skill trigger amount, or what the calculator calls the expected skill count. Let's use another skill specialist instead, because I'm sick of seeing ingredient magnet. Let's try something more fancy, extra helpful. It doesn't matter what main skill I choose here, this is just for illustration purposes to show you what stats would increase the skill trigger. So let's start with level 50, neutral, skills, and nature. And here are the settings for my sleep. So I'm going to set it at 8.5 hours of sleep, 1 session in a day, and I'm going to keep my Pokemon at maximum energy, just to simplify the maths. And what we've got is Gallade will start at 3.9 skill triggers. in a day when it has no stats, no nature, and level 50. So the question is, how high can we get this number? What types of sub-skills and natures should we give Gallade in order for it to have the highest number of skill triggers in a day? So let's go with speed. Now speed is something that improves both berry production, ingredient production, and skill production. So it's no surprise that if I choose speed here, that number will go up to 4.2. So it's an improvement because having higher speed means that you have more productions, and that means more chances to trigger the skill. But how does it compare to main skill chance up? Because with speed, our skill trigger amount went up about 0.3. If we now change it to main skill chance up, so relative to speed up, we've now lost some speed but gained skill chance, then it's a little better. So for a skill specialist, you should still try to have main skill chance up, but having speed up, it will still improve the Pokemon. Where it gets tricky is when we start talking about sub-skills, because there are different tiers. Let's start with the obvious one, skill trigger M. So skill trigger M will bring that 4.6 skill count per day to a whopping 5.9 skill triggers a day. So in total, we've gained an extra 1 whole skill trigger every day by having skill trigger M. But what if we remove skill trigger M and gave it helping speed instead? Then it does go down a little bit, down to 5.2 skill triggers a day. So between skill trigger M and helping speed M, it makes a lot of sense for you to go for skill trigger M if possible, because you're gonna get more skill triggers. The only downside is that skill trigger doesn't actually improve your berry production, whereas helping speed does. Regardless, we're going to focus on skill here because we're talking about skill specialists, we're not talking about berry specialists. If you really wanted berry production, you would focus on a berry specialist. But how about if we compare helping speed M to a lower tier skill trigger? So skill trigger S. As you can see, with skill trigger S, it's actually very close to the number that you get with helping speed M. They're both around that 5.2 to 5.3 region, but neither will beat skill trigger M. How about if we switch to helping bonus? Now you should understand that helping bonus is normally a 5% speed boost on the Pokemon, but it applies to the entire team. So in a single helper analysis, it wouldn't be fair to only count 5%. It does count 5% in the calculator only in team analysis because it can apply that speed stat to your entire team. In the Pokédex, it will apply 25% instead. It's actually a little bit more complicated than saying that it applies 25%, but we're not going to dive into it in this video. Regardless, think of it as a 25% speed boost. Otherwise, it wouldn't be fair on this sub-skill to say that it only applies a 5% speed boost. And with helping bonus, we get again up to a very high 5.6 skill triggers, which is still not quite skill trigger M, but we're getting close. But what is interesting is that it's better than skill trigger S because the speed boost is just that much. So in other words, if I could choose the best stats for my skill specialist, I would actually start with skill trigger M, then follow it with helping bonus rather than skill trigger S, and then followed by either helping speed M or skill trigger S. They would be around the same tier between these two. You should think of skill trigger S as, well, the bottom tier skill trigger and therefore not worth as much as the top two tiers of helping speed. But don't forget that you can upgrade skill trigger S as long as skill trigger M doesn't also exist in the skill pool. So in other words, I would be fine with something like this as well because I would be able to upgrade that skill trigger S. Essentially still coming back to this situation where I have a lot of speed and skill trigger M. So why don't we take a look at the actual outcome if I have the best stats that I believe would give the most skill triggers. So skill trigger M, helping bonus, and helping speed gives Gallade a whopping 8.5 skill triggers in a day. And just remember that number for a moment because we're going to swap out helping speed M with skill trigger S, and you can see that it actually falls down a bit in terms of the total triggers. And that's because total skill count does account for how fast your Pokemon is, not just the skill trigger. But there's one more thing. The advantage of helping speed is that you're also getting berries and ingredients. So in other words, in terms of an overall outcome, these 3 skills are the best. Now, we're not talking about berries today, but I just want to point out that of course it's also good to have Berry Finding S because that already doubles the berry output on your skill specialist, and at the end of the day, we're just trying to get that Snorlax strength up, so having Berry Finding S is always a good thing. Unfortunately, Berry Finding S means that your Pokemon's inventory will fill up much quicker, and if your Pokemon's inventory has reached maximum, then it can no longer trigger skill. So Berry Finding S also works quite well if you also have inventory at the same time. These two would go hand in hand, so that the skill trigger is not nerfed. Having said that, if you're clearing your inventory on your Pokemon all day, every day, and you're logging into the game very frequently, it's not really necessary for inventory to be there, except for long sleeps where you can't clear the Pokemon's inventory. So while inventory is helpful, it is not the top tier stat for a skill specialist. So in other words, this set of sub-skills would be my preferred skill specialist. Now, another common question that I get asked is, what if you have really good sub-skills? Let's say ideal sub-skills, but unfortunately you have a bad nature. So maybe even main skill down nature. How harmful is that? And to illustrate this point, Banana Tanks has made this graphic to show us the total skill trigger effects of all sorts of combinations of skill trigger M, skill trigger S, main skill chance up, main skill chance down. Basically every combination there is. What isn't included here is helping speed because the chart would just be way too long. You should be using a calculator for that if you're looking at helping speed as well. But in terms of skill trigger rate per production, these are the multiplier effects from having these combinations of skill. So this is how you read the chart. If you have main skill chance up nature and also both skill triggers, then your rate multiplier is 1.8. compared to if you had no skills at all and a neutral nature. So almost twice as much skill trigger compared to neutral. But the moment you have main skill chance down, even if you have all sorts of skill trigger in your sub skills, that becomes a 1.2 multiplier, which is not even as good as just having skill trigger M by itself. So main skill chance down is actually very harmful, and that's the main takeaway from this chart. It's not the numbers, but for you to see that main skill chance down is really harmful. And by the way, you can find these infographics that Banana Tanks made in the infographics in my Discord, so it's right here. What if we have skill trigger up but speed down and vice versa? So right now I've got neutral nature and Gallade procs 7.2 times. And let's go and give it what we had before first, the main skill chance up and EXP down. EXP down has neutral effects. So our best Gallade here would provide 8.5 triggers a day. Our neutral Gallade provides 7.2 triggers a day. If we had main skill chance up but speed down, then it is still an overall beneficial amount. So we've got 7.8 triggers, which is still very high. It's still better than the neutral effects for skill trigger. Of course, we haven't accounted for the fact that it will also produce less berries because of the speed down, but for skill purposes, it's doing just fine. On the contrary, if we have skill chance down and speed up, so that's the naughty nature, our skill trigger drops to about 6.4, which is nearly 1 whole less trigger compared to neutral nature and 2 whole less triggers compared to ideal nature. So main skill chance down, even if you have speed up for the nature, is still quite harmful. So in summary, in terms of the total skill trigger, so we're going to ignore Berry Finding S for now because that's about berry strength. If we only want to focus on as many skill triggers as possible for a skill specialist, how would you rank sub-skills? Now, I made this chart some time ago demonstrating what are the great sub-skills for a skill specialists are, what are sort of good sub skills and what are neutral sub skills for a skill specialist. And I've already explained everything once, so I'm not going to do that in this video, but I am going to give it a ranking now from within this amazing subcategory, and we're going to ignore the free to play skills, the skill level up. Not that they're not good. The thing you want most for skill trigger to happen the most is number 1, skill trigger M. The second most desirable sub-skill is helping bonus, 2, followed by helping speed, 3, because helping speed just about produces the same as skill trigger S in the total sub-skills under most situations, additionally producing more berries and ingredients as a bonus. Then it's skill trigger S as number 4 and helping speed S as number 5. Of course, don't forget that you can upgrade skill trigger S as long as skill trigger M is not also in the sub skills. So if you have either of these, you are doing just fine. Just try not to have both if it takes away a slot for helping speed and helping bonus. You can find this chart under quick guides in my Discord as well. Hopefully this clarifies what are some of the best skills for skill specialist. Now remember I said that there are situations where skill trigger, even if it's skill trigger S, is going to be better than helping bonus or helping speed. And there aren't that many situations, but they do exist. We're going to go over to production comparison to see this. That's because we can see the breakdown in the skill triggers. And what I've done here is given Gallade the exact same stats as we did in the Pokedex option. And I would like to just briefly mention that the calculator has a bug right now for extra helpful skill specialists where the extra help isn't actually being added to the total strength. That will be corrected at a later point. Right now it only accounts for the actual berry and ingredient strength, but you can just add these numbers yourself. Alright, so where skill trigger is actually more useful than helping speed is this number here. This number is how likely your Pokemon is not going to trigger skill in the morning. So it's the inverse logic here. That's a no skill trigger. So after a long sleep of about 8.5 hours, there's a 7% chance that my Gallade will not trigger skill. First thing in the morning, when I tap on it, there's only a very low chance, 7.5% chance that it won't trigger skill. Yes, it's got the best stats that will trigger 8.5 times in a day. That does include that one trigger in the morning, but this number will improve if you have more skill trigger as opposed to more speed. So what we want is this number to go down because we want trigger to happen. This is the chance of no trigger. And if we swap out helping speed for skill trigger S, you will see that the chance of no trigger now has gone down to 5%. Now, of course, at this point, you might say 5 and 7% is not big enough a difference for me to worry about, and that the extra berry strength is worth that helping speed. Yes, that's true. But this number represents a little more than just long sleep. If you're the type of player that logs in only 3, maybe 4 times a day, this number actually represents how likely you are to get that skill to trigger when you do log in. So what you can do is, for example, instead of adding another sleep session, let's say this is how long it takes for you to be away from the game. Let's say maybe I'm at work at 1 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and there's no way I can normally open the game during that time. Well, this number tells me that there's a 6% chance that the skill won't trigger after all that time. Let's take a shorter period of time as another example. So let's say there's only 1.5 hours in which I'm unable to log into the game for the second sleep. Then there's a 17% chance that Gallade won't have a skill. And again, if we now change back to speed as opposed to skill trigger, so let's go with helping speed. This time, the number actually went the other way. And that's because being away from the game for 1.5 hours, Gallade probably hasn't reached its carry limit. In which case, having more speed, in other words more productions, therefore overall also more chance to skill trigger, it still works out that helping speed will provide a better chance at skill trigger after 1.5 hours. But should your inventory limit be reached on that Pokemon, then skill trigger becomes more important. I hope that makes sense to you, because I had thought long and hard about how to explain this concept, and this is the best I can do. You want more speed if you frequently log into the game. You can have more skill trigger if you don't log into the game frequently. And when you do log into the game, your Pokemon are likely having reached their carry limit. But if you still don't understand what I'm saying, then all I can say is let's keep it simple, go for these sub-skills in this order. Thank you for watching, guys. If I've confused you, make sure to leave a like and subscribe.